History has a way of whispering secrets just beneath the surface, hiding stories of power, mystery, and divinity in the shadows of time. And when it comes to the ancient world, we often hear about the gods, mighty Zeus, wise Athena, fierce Odin. But what about the goddesses who shaped civilizations, guided warriors, and ruled the cosmos, only to fade into obscurity? Today, we're pulling back the veil on 25 forgotten goddesses of antiquity, figures who once commanded worship, inspired legends, and held the fate of empires in their hands, yet somehow slipped through the cracks of history. Imagine standing in the ruins of a temple, your fingers brushing against weathered stone carved with symbols no one remembers. Who were these divine women? What stories did they carry? From the depths of Mesopotamia to the shores of the Mediterranean, these goddesses were once as revered as any Olympian or Norse deity. Some were creators weaving the fabric of existence. Others were destroyers, their wrath feared across kingdoms. And then, slowly, their names were erased, their altars abandoned, their power rewritten into silence. But their legacy lingers, hidden in fragments of pottery, half-buried inscriptions, and tales passed down in hushed tones. This isn't just a journey into mythology, it's a rediscovery of the sacred feminine, a chance to reclaim voices lost to time. We'll unravel the mysteries of goddesses like the Mesopotamian Ninlil, who walked the line between life and death, or the Celtic Epona, whose horses carried souls to the afterlife. You'll meet healers, warriors, and tricksters, each with a story that challenges what we think we know about the ancient world. So settle in, because by the end of this, you'll see history and divinity in a whole new light. The past is waiting to speak. Let's listen. Beneath the scorching sun of ancient Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers carved life into the desert, stood the temples of a goddess whose name once echoed through the streets of Sumer, Nanch. She wasn't just a deity of the heavens, she was a voice for the voiceless, a divine guardian of orphans, widows, and the downtrodden. In a world where kings and warriors dominated the historical record, Nanch's legacy was written in acts of compassion and the quiet power of dreams. Her temple in the city of Nina was more than a place of worship, it was a sanctuary for justice. Believers would come to her priests seeking interpretations of their dreams, which were seen as messages from the divine. But Nanch's role went beyond prophecy. She was the cosmic judge who weighed the actions of rulers and commoners alike, ensuring fairness in a society where power often tipped the scales. Imagine a courtroom etched into the walls of her temple, where the guilty trembled and the oppressed found solace. Yet what's most striking is how her worship reflected the values of Sumer itself. At a time when empires rose and fell on conquest, Nanch's cult thrived on empathy. She didn't demand grand sacrifices. Instead, her festivals included feeding the poor and protecting those cast aside by fate. But as Sumer crumbled under the weight of invasions and shifting power, her influence waned. The Babylonians absorbed many Sumerian gods into their pantheon, but Nanch's distinct voice, her focus on justice over might, faded into silence. Today, only fragments of hymns and scattered inscriptions whisper of her once unshakable presence. So why does Nanch matter now? Because she reminds us that even in antiquity, divinity wasn't just about thunder and war. Some gods wielded mercy as their weapon, and their stories buried under centuries of dust still have the power to resonate. Now let's journey to the city of Lagash, where the air smelled of burning herbs and the sound of barking dogs carried through the streets, a sign that Bao, the lion-headed goddess of healing, was near. Unlike the distant, untouchable deities of Olympus, Bao walked among her people. She wasn't just worshipped, she was a presence, her iconography a striking blend of ferocity and compassion. A woman's body crowned with the head of a lioness, often depicted with a pack of dogs at her heels. These weren't ordinary animals, they were her sacred messengers, symbols of loyalty and healing, their saliva believed to have curative properties. Bao's domain was medicine, but her approach was anything but clinical. Healing in ancient Sumer wasn't just about potions or surgeries. It was a spiritual act, a dance between the earthly and the divine. Her priests, who doubled as physicians, would diagnose illnesses by studying dreams, animal behaviors, and even the flicker of oil on water. But Bao's most fascinating rituals revolved around her festivals, particularly the Day of Bao, when the sick would line the streets offering clay dog figurines in exchange for her mercy. Imagine the scene, the scent of myrrh thick in the air, the low chants of priests, and the hopeful whispers of mothers pressing these tiny effigies into the hands of temple attendants praying for a cure. Yet Bao's story takes a bittersweet turn. As empires shifted and pantheons merged, her identity began to blur. The Babylonian goddess Gula, another healer, slowly absorbed Bao's attributes, folding her into a broader, more generalized divine physician. Bao's festivals faded, her lioness visage softened into Gula's more approachable form, and her dogs, once central to her myth, became mere footnotes. But if you look closely at Babylonian medical texts, you'll still find traces of her, prescriptions invoking the Lady Who Binds Wounds, a title that once belonged to Bao alone. What does her disappearance tell us? Perhaps that even gods aren't immune to the tides of time. But Bao's legacy lingers in the unlikeliest places. Modern medicine symbol, the caduceus, twists with echoes of her serpentine staff, and the idea of healing as both science and sacred trust. That was Bao's gift long before Hippocrates took his oath. Deep in the lush rainforests of West Africa, where the air hums with the secrets of ancient roots and vines, the Yoruba people once whispered the name of Oja, a goddess who didn't just dwell in the forest but was the forest itself. She wasn't a distant figure on a throne. She moved like the wind through leaves, her presence felt in the rustle of branches and the scent of crushed herbs. To the Yoruba, Oja was the ultimate herbalist, the keeper of remedies so potent they could heal the body and awaken the spirit. Her knowledge wasn't written in scrolls but passed down through generations of healers, each plant a syllable in her sacred language. Picture a world where medicine wasn't separated from magic, where a single leaf could mend a broken bone or reveal a hidden truth. Oja's devotees, often women, were the bridge between this world and hers, gathering plants at dawn with rituals so precise they'd sing to the earth before plucking even a single stem. The forest wasn't just a pantry of cures, it was a living library, and Oja its librarian. Stories tell of hunters who stumbled into her domain and emerged with visions, or mothers who prayed to her for children and left with bundles of uia, that leaf of life, tucked into their waistbands. But Oja's story took a brutal turn with the arrival of colonial forces. As foreign religions and systems dismissed her as mere superstition, her temples were abandoned, her priests silenced. The very forests that embodied her were cut down, replaced by plantations and roads. Yet Oja refused to vanish. She survived in the stubborn persistence of oral traditions, proverbs comparing her wisdom to the deep roots of the Iroko tree, or folktales where she appears as an old woman testing the kindness of strangers by offering herbs in disguise. Even today, Yoruba herbalists still invoke her name when harvesting, a quiet rebellion against erasure. What's remarkable isn't just Oja's resilience, but how she reemerges in unexpected places. Modern botanists studying traditional remedies often find themselves retracing her footsteps, discovering plants her followers knew for centuries. The legacy of a goddess isn't always carved in stone. Sometimes it grows wild in the places we've forgotten to look. In the emerald green rice fields of Cambodia, where the monsoon rains turn the earth into a mirror of the sky, farmers still whisper prayers to Pajaoyan, the forgotten goddess who once ensured their harvest. Long before Hinduism's grand temples rose over the Khmer landscape, she was the heartbeat of the land, a deity not of wars or cosmic battles, but of something far more vital, the humble grain that fed a civilization. Her name itself is a testament to her power, blending Pajao, meaning rice, with Yan, an ancient term for sacredness. Pajaoyan's rituals were woven into the rhythm of agrarian life. Before planting, farmers would leave offerings of palm sugar and fresh fruit at the edge of their fields, asking her blessing for the seeds. During harvest, the first stalks were always cut by hand, never with a blade, and laid at makeshift shrines as tokens of gratitude. These weren't grand ceremonies performed in stone temples, but intimate acts of devotion, passed down through generations like the seeds themselves. The goddess's presence was felt in the sweat of laborers, the weight of ripe grain, and the shared meals that followed a successful harvest. But history, like the monsoon winds, shifted direction. With the rise of Hindu influence in the region, particularly under the Khmer Empire, gods like Vishnu and Shiva eclipsed the local deities. Pajaoyan's worship was relegated to the margins, her name absent from the carvings of Angkor Wat. Yet she never truly disappeared. In remote villages far from the grand urban centers, farmers continued to honor her in secret, blending her rites with Hindu practices. Offerings once made solely to Pajaoyan were now shared with Lakshmi, the Hindu goddess of prosperity, but the heart of the ritual, the plea for a bountiful harvest, remained unchanged. Today, traces of Pajaoyan linger in the quiet persistence of rural traditions. In some communities, elderly women still lead ceremonies where rice wine is poured onto the soil as a libation, or where children are taught to bow to the fields before eating, a remnant of the old reverence for the goddess. Even the way rice is stored neatly bundled and never stepped over harks back to taboos rooted in her worship. These practices are more than folklore, they're a living thread connecting modern Cambodia to an ancient spiritual landscape. What makes Pajaoyan's story so compelling isn't just her resilience, but the universality of her domain. Rice isn't merely a crop, it's life, culture, identity. And in a world where industrial agriculture often divorces food from its sacred origins, her legacy whispers a reminder: every grain holds a story. The Khmer farmers who still honor her may not carve her name in stone, but they keep her alive in the most powerful way possible, through the act of feeding their families season after season. In the rolling hills of ancient Britain, where mist clung to the valleys and the earth pulsed with hidden springs, the Celts revered a goddess whose name meant "she who dwells by the sacred grove," Arnemisha. Unlike the thunderous deities of war or the distant sky gods, Arnemisha's power flowed quietly, bubbling up from the depths of the land itself. Her domain was the life-giving waters of Akwi Arnemeshi, what we now call Buxton, where steam rose from thermal springs like breath from the earth. To the Celtic tribes, these weren't just pools of warm water. They were doorways to the otherworld, places where Arnemisha's touch could heal the sick, bless the barren, and whisper prophecies to those who listened. The Romans, ever practical conquerors, recognized the strategic value of these springs, but they also saw something deeper. When they built their sprawling bath complex at Akwi Arnemeshi, they didn't erase the local goddess. They tried to fold her into their own pantheon. Arnemisha became associated with their goddess Minerva, a patroness of wisdom and healing, and later with Suli's Minerva at Bath. On the surface, this might seem like preservation, even reverence. But in truth, it was a slow erosion. The Romans didn't just adopt Arnemisha, they diluted her, sanding down the rough edges of her Celtic identity until she became a footnote in their own religious narrative. What's fascinating is how much resisted assimilation. Even under Roman rule, offerings to Arnemisha continued, coins tossed into the springs, clay votives shaped like limbs left by those seeking cures. These weren't the grand marble statues of Roman gods, but humble, persistent acts of faith. The springs themselves held power the Romans couldn't fully co-opt. Local priests, though forced to speak Latin, still whispered the old invocations. The water, after all, remembered its true name. Yet as Christianity spread and Roman influence waned, Arnemisha's presence faded further. The baths crumbled, her name slipped from common speech, and the sacred groves were cut down. But like water seeping through cracks, traces of her remained. In Buxton today, the thermal springs still flow, though few who visit know they're stepping into Arnemisha's domain. The town's crest bears a sheaf of wheat and a pitcher of water, subtle nods to a goddess of fertility and healing whose worship once shaped the landscape. Why does this matter? Because Arnemisha's story isn't just about religious syncretism. It's about how empires rewrite spirituality, how the conqueror's gods overshadow the old ones, but also how the land itself holds memory. The Romans may have renamed her springs, but the water still rises, warm and insistent, from the same depths it always has. Some truths, like Arnemisha's legacy, refuse to be buried. In the shadowed alleys of medieval Jewish mysticism, where scholars pored over texts by candlelight and the divine was mapped in layers of hidden meaning, there existed a goddess-like figure so potent she threatened to rewrite the very fabric of tradition matronet. She wasn't just a myth or metaphor. In Kabbalistic thought, she was the living embodiment of the feminine divine, the sacred counterpart to God himself. Picture the celestial realms as a grand marriage. Matronet was the bride, the queen, the force that balanced the masculine energy of creation. Her name itself, derived from the Latin matrona, meaning noblewoman, hints at a regal, almost defiant presence in a tradition that often sidelined the feminine. Matronet's power lay in her symbolism. She was the moon to God's sun, the receptive vessel through which divine energy flowed into the world. Kabbalists depicted her as the lower mother, the Shekinah, God's immanent presence on earth, but with a twist. While Shekinah was often portrayed as passive, Matronet was dynamic, even rebellious. Ancient texts describe her as a figure who could withhold blessings or unleash judgment, her moods shifting like the phases of the moon. In one startling Kabbalistic legend, she even separates from her divine consort during times of human sin, causing cosmic imbalance until repentance restores their union. This wasn't just theology, it was a radical reimagining of feminine agency within a patriarchal framework. Yet Matronet's story is also one of suppression. As rabbinic authorities grew wary of mysticism's more unorthodox elements, her worship was gradually sanitized. The rise of institutional Judaism in the Middle Ages favored a more abstract, genderless conception of the divine, and Matronet's vivid imagery, her crown, her throne, her celestial dance, was folded back into the safer, more neutered concept of Shekinah. What was once a goddess in all but name became a whisper, a shadow of her former self. Even the Zohar, Kabbalah's foundational text, sometimes downplays her autonomy, reframing her as a dependent extension of male divinity rather than a force in her own right. But here's the twist: Matronet never fully disappeared. In secretive mystical circles, particularly among Jewish women, her legacy endured. Amulets invoking her protection were hidden in birthing rooms, and midwives recited prayers to her during childbirth, calling on her as a guardian of life's threshold. Some Hasidic traditions even preserved her lunar symbolism, teaching that the righteous could see Matronet's face in the moon's glow. These weren't just folk superstitions, they were acts of quiet resistance, a way of keeping the divine feminine alive in a tradition that had tried to erase her. The tension between Matronet and Shekinah reveals something profound about how spirituality evolves. Shekinah, though revered, often serves as a consoling presence, a comforting light in exile. Matronet, by contrast, was disruptive, demanding. She wasn't just God's dwelling place, she was his partner, his equal, sometimes even his adversary. To acknowledge her was to admit that the divine could be as fiercely feminine as it was masculine, as chaotic as it was orderly. That idea, it seems, was too dangerous to last, at least in the open. But like all forgotten goddesses, Matronet lingers, her echo audible to those who know where to listen. In the moonlit rituals of Kabbalists, in the untold stories of Jewish mystics, and perhaps in the quiet spaces where faith still makes room for the sacred feminine. Before time was measured in dynasties, when the sky was unfinished and the earth still soft, China's oldest legends speak of a goddess with the body of a serpent and the hands of a craftsman, Nuwa. She didn't just shape the world, she salvaged it, While many creation myths feature gods forging order from chaos, Nuwa's story is different. Hers is a tale of cosmic repair, a divine hand stitching the heavens back together when they threaten to collapse. According to ancient texts, the pillars holding up the sky shattered, leaving gaping holes through which wildfires raged and floods poured. Nuwa didn't summon an army or demand worship, she rolled up her sleeves. Gathering stones of 5 sacred colors, she melted them into mortar and patched the broken sky with her bare hands. She then slaughtered a giant turtle, using its legs as new pillars to steady the heavens. But her most enduring act was sculpting humanity itself. Some versions say she molded figures from yellow clay, breathing life into each one. Others claim she dipped a rope in mud and flicked it, the droplets becoming people, explaining why the noble handcrafted and the common splattered exist. What's striking isn't just Nuwa's creativity, but her ambiguity. Early myths never assign her a fixed gender. She's called Mother of Mortals, yet her serpentine form and solitary power defy traditional feminine roles. In a world where later deities like the Jade Emperor would reign as paternal authorities, Nuwa existed outside such binaries, a fluid, primal force, but history isn't kind to complexity. As Confucianism rose, its rigid hierarchies favored male-centric order. Nuwa's myths were rewritten, her cosmic repairs downplayed, her serpent imagery softened into something more respectable. By the Han Dynasty, she'd been recast as the subordinate wife of the god Fuxi, her solo achievements folded into his narrative. Temples that once celebrated her as the supreme creator now depicted her demurely seated beside him, her hands no longer clutching tools but folded in lap. Yet Nuwa refused to vanish entirely. Folk traditions kept her alive in secret. Pottery guilds worshipped her as their patron, whispering prayers before molding clay. Midwives invoked her during births, recalling how she'd shaped life itself. Even today, traces linger. In the vibrant hues of traditional Chinese roof tiles said to echo her 5-colored stones, or in the dragon boat festivals, zongzi, sticky rice wrapped in leaves like the parcels she might have carried. Her legacy is a reminder some forces are too foundational to erase. The sky may have been mended, but the cracks still tell a story. And if you listen closely, you might hear the whisper of scales against stone, the sound of a goddess who refuses to be forgotten. High in the rugged mountains of ancient Armenia, where the air smelled of wild thyme and the rivers ran silver with melted snow, the goddess Anahit reigned supreme. She wasn't just a deity, she was the lifeblood of the land, worshipped as the mother of fertility, healing, and sacred waters. Her temples gleamed with gold, her statues adorned with ruby-eyed crowns, and her priests wielded influence that rivaled kings. To the Armenians, Anahit wasn't merely their protector, she was the embodiment of Armenia itself, a divine reflection of the nation's soul. Comparisons to Artemis or Aphrodite only scratch the surface. Anahit was fiercer, more visceral. While Greek goddesses presided over idealized beauty or distant wilderness, Anahit's power was raw and immediate. Pilgrims traveled for weeks to her great temple at Erez, where they'd pour wine libations over her bronze feet, praying for healthy children, bountiful harvests, or cures for ailments. The rituals were intoxicating literally. Drums pounded as worshippers danced in ecstatic circles, their bodies anointed with honey and saffron, the air thick with smoke from sacred bonfires. Unlike the restrained cults of Olympus, Anahit's worship was a sensory explosion, a celebration of life's unapologetic abundance. But then came the cross. When Armenia became the first nation to adopt Christianity as its state religion in the year 301, Anahit's world crumbled. Her temples, once thrumming with music and offerings, were targeted for destruction. The golden statue at Erez was smashed, its pieces melted down to fund churches. Yet the priests of the new faith quickly realized something unsettling. The people refused to abandon her. They still whispered her name at childbirth, still left offerings at old shrines hidden in groves. The solution, syncretism. Anahit's traits were folded into the Virgin Mary, her nurturing aspects, her connection to water, even her title as Mother of Armenia. Churches were built atop her sacred springs, rewriting her memory without fully erasing it. Today, traces of Anahit linger in plain sight. At the monastery of Serp Karapet, pilgrims still tie strips of cloth to a centuries-old tree, a practice directly borrowed from her cult. In the village of Armavir, a ruined temple's foundation stones are said to grant fertility to women who walk barefoot across them. And in the rituals of Armenian neo-pagans, her name is chanted anew, a defiant echo against centuries of silence. Anahit's story isn't just about religious conquest, it's about the tenacity of cultural memory. They took her gold, but not her essence. They toppled her statues, but not her presence. Because some goddesses don't fade, they simply change shape, flowing like the sacred rivers they once ruled. Through the dense, whispering forests of ancient Slavic lands, where winter's grip seemed unbreakable, there strode a goddess who carried spring in her footsteps, Diziwana. Unlike the delicate flower maidens of other myths, Diziwana was a huntress, her bow strung with sunlight, her cloak woven from the first thaw. She didn't just herald the season, she was the season, fierce and untamed, stalking the remnants of winter's frost and driving it back with every arrow loosed. To compare her to Diana, the Roman huntress, is to glimpse only half her power. While Diana ruled over wilderness as something separate, sacred and distant, Diziwana merged with it. She wasn't just the protector of the forest, she was its heartbeat, its voice, its unyielding pulse. Her rituals were as wild as she was. Villagers celebrated her return in early spring with bonfires so massive they could be seen for miles, leaping over flames to purify themselves and ensure fertility. Young girls wove crowns of early blooming flowers, then cast them into rivers as offerings, watching the currents carry their prayers to the goddess. But the most striking tradition was the Chodzani Z Diziwana, the walking with Diziwana. A chosen maiden, dressed in green and crowned with birch twigs, would lead a procession through the fields, blessing each furrow with a touch of her staff. It wasn't ceremonial, it was spellwork, a literal summoning of life from the barren earth. Then came the cross and the sword. Christian missionaries, confronted with a goddess who refused to be tamed, launched a campaign of whispers. Diziwana's independence, her closeness to nature's untamed cycles, made her dangerous. Slowly, deliberately, they recast her as a demon, her sacred groves. Haunts of witches, her midnight hunts, Sabbaths of the damned. The maiden who once wore flowers now bore horns in popular woodcuts, her bow twisted into a pitchfork. Even her name was corrupted, morphed into Diziwika, a term for virgin, stripping away her wildness and reducing her to a passive symbol, yet the land remembered. In Polish folklore, she survived as Diziwana Zimienka, a spirit who roamed the fields at dawn, her hair tangled with dew. Bulgarian tales spoke of Samodiva, ethereal women who danced in forest clearings, their arrows never missing their mark. These weren't mere stories, they were fragments of a suppressed divinity, stubbornly persisting in the collective memory. Even the word Diziuksina, meaning girl in modern Polish, carries her echo, a linguistic ghost of the goddess who once taught women to be untamed. Diziwana's fate reveals a brutal truth. When a culture's gods are demonized, it's often the feminine, the wild, the uncontrollable that are targeted first. But notice how she endures, not in grand temples, but in the way spring still arrives, relentless and unapologetic. The frost always retreats, the huntress never truly lays down her bow. Under the emerald canopy of the Yucatan, where the shrill cries of howler monkeys mingled with the scent of copal incense, the Maya revered a goddess who defied simple labels, Ixchel. Often reduced to a gentle moon goddess in modern retellings, her true nature was far more complex, a whirlwind of contradictions wrapped in jaguar skin. Yes, she governed the lunar cycles, but she also commanded storms, presided over bloodletting rituals, and guided women through the razor's edge of childbirth with the precision of a warrior. Her temples on Cozumel Island drew pilgrims from across Mesoamerica, not just expectant mothers, but warriors seeking her favor before battle, and physicians apprenticing under her priestesses to learn the secrets of medicinal plants. The Spanish conquistadors, however, saw only what fit their narrative. When friars like Diego de Landa documented Maya beliefs, they scrubbed Ixchel of her fierceness, recasting her as a passive lunar figure to align with their Virgin Mary archetype. But the truth lay in the details they ignored. The jaguar claws etched into her stone altars, the murals showing her clutching serpents like scepters, the midwives who still invoked her name during deliveries with the same reverence as their ancestors. Ixchel wasn't just a fertility symbol. She was the patron of Ciechulul, the life force that flowed through blood, whether spilled in sacrifice or childbirth. What's tragic is how thoroughly her worship was fragmented. The Spanish burned her codices, demolished her island shrines, and forbade the making of her traditional ceramic figurines, those round-bellied, grinning statues that once lined the bedsides of laboring women. Yet like water seeping through stone, her essence persisted. In remote villages, healers continued to brew remedies from the extabenton flower, whispering Ixchel's name as they worked. The ritual sweat baths temazcales, where women once prayed to her for safe deliveries, were rebranded as Christian ceremonies, but the steam still carried her old prayers. Even the moon goddess simplification hides a darker irony. The moon, in Maya cosmology, wasn't just a gentle glow, it was the sun's rival, an unpredictable force that could bring madness or revelation. Ixchel's lunar aspect wasn't about tranquility, it reflected her dual nature as both creator and destroyer. Modern scholars tracing her worship note how Spanish accounts deliberately omitted her storm-wielding epithets like Chacchel, Great Rainbow, which tied her to floods and chaos. They couldn't erase her entirely, so they diluted her until she fit neatly into their colonial framework, yet fragments of her power still surface. In the 21st century, Maya activists restoring traditional practices have reclaimed Ixchel's full legacy, teaching that her jaguar spirit wasn't just a symbol of protection, it was a reminder that creation and destruction are two sides of the same sacred blade. The next time you hear her called a moon goddess, remember, the moon casts shadows too, and in those shadows the jaguar still watches. In the muddy shallows of the Nile, where reeds swayed and crocodiles lurked, the Egyptians worshipped a goddess whose very form defied convention, Taweret, the hippopotamus deity of childbirth and protection. Picture her, a towering figure with the body of a pregnant hippo, the paws of a lion, and the spine of a crocodile, her gaping mouth frozen in a perpetual snarl. To modern eyes, she might seem monstrous, but to the women of ancient Egypt, she was salvation. Taweret embodied the paradox of the hippo itself, a creature both nurturing and deadly. Mothers knew the animal would fight to the death for its young, just as it could crush a boat with terrifying ease. This duality made her the perfect guardian for life's most fragile moments. Her amulets were everywhere in Egyptian households, carved from faience or hematite, strung around necks, tucked beneath beds, even pressed into the wrappings of newborns. These weren't mere trinkets, they were weapons against chaos. Demons like Apep, the serpent of darkness, were said to fear Taweret's grotesque majesty. Midwives would place her figurines at the foot of birthing stools, trusting her to ward off evil spirits with the sheer force of her presence. Even the god Set, the ultimate trickster, steered clear of her domain. There's something deeply human in this, a recognition that the act of bringing life into the world required not just gentleness but ferocity. Yet despite her vital role, Taweret never gained the prestige of deities like Isis or Hathor. Her exclusion from the grand temple complexes wasn't an accident. The state religion favored gods who mirrored political power, cosmic rulers like Ra or judges like Osiris. Taweret belonged to the dusty, blood and sweat reality of homes rather than the polished halls of priesthoods. Her worship was personal, intimate, often led by women themselves rather than male scribes or pharaohs. When the Greeks took over Egypt, their fascination with civilized goddesses like Isis further sidelined her. A hippopotamus goddess simply didn't fit their aesthetic ideals of divinity. But here's the twist: Taweret outlasted them all. Even as organized cults faded, her amulets persisted, found in Roman-era graves, Coptic Christian villages, and medieval market stalls. Modern archaeologists have unearthed them far beyond Egypt's borders, traded along routes reaching as far as Spain. Some theorize this was more than commerce. Perhaps mothers everywhere recognized something universal in her snarling protection. Today, her legacy lingers in surprising places. The Coptic Church quietly adapted her into tales of Saint Tabitha, a protector of women. And in the hushed conversations of Egyptian midwives, you might still hear the old invocations passed down like heirlooms. Taweret's story isn't just about a forgotten goddess, it's about the quiet power of what gets labeled folk religion. The gods of the temples may have the grandest statues, but the gods of the hearth, they're the ones who survive. Beneath the sprawling Iroko trees of Igboland, where the red earth cracked underfoot and the ancestors' whispers rustled through the leaves, the goddess Ala ruled not just the land but the very conscience of her people. She wasn't merely an earth deity, she was the embodiment of justice, the keeper of Omnala, the sacred customs that bound Igbo society together. Unlike distant, abstract gods, Ala's presence was immediate, tactile. Her shrine stood at the heart of villages, often marked by oji trees, their roots cradling the bones of the dead and their branches stretching toward the living. To offend Ala wasn't just blasphemy, it was an unraveling of the social fabric itself. Her authority extended far beyond fertility rituals. Ala presided over the Ikparik, the moral court where disputes were settled not by written laws but by divination, oath-taking, and the collective memory of elders. A farmer accused of stealing yams might be brought before her altar, forced to swear on her name, a test with lethal stakes, for Ala's justice was swift. Liars were said to swell with unnatural illnesses, their bodies betraying their deceit. Her judgments weren't arbitrary. They reflected the Igbo concept of NKWEK balance. A crime against the community, murder, sacrilege, violating the sacred Ani land, required restitution not just to humans but to Ala herself. Offerings of white chalk, palm wine, and sacrificial animals were meant to cool the earth, restoring harmony. Then came the colonial rupture. British administrators, baffled by a legal system that had no prisons or written codes, dismissed Omnala as primitive superstition. Courts established by the colonial government replaced Ala's shrines, her priests sidelined in favor of warrant chiefs handpicked by the British. The sacred groves where oaths were sworn were bulldozed for roads, the Ikparik gatherings were outlawed as heathen tribunals. But the most insidious damage was ideological. Missionaries reframed Ala as a mere fertility idol, stripping her of her judicial role to make Christianity appear morally superior. The goddess who once arbitrated truth became, in colonial records, a silent figurehead, a symbol of the past they sought to erase. Yet Ala refused to disappear. In secret, villagers continued to bring land disputes to her priests, knowing British courts couldn't comprehend the spiritual weight of soil pollution or broken taboos. During the Nigerian Civil War, Igbo soldiers carried amulets of her sacred earth into battle, believing it would shield them. Even today, remnants of her influence persist. Modern Igbo activists campaigning against environmental destruction invoke her name, framing deforestation as a violation of Ani. The annual Ala festival in some communities still features mock trials, a poignant echo of her once unchallenged authority. What colonial records called progress was in truth a fracture, a severing of the bond between land, law, and divinity. But Ala's legacy lingers in the stubborn resilience of Igbo proverbs. Alabu Odogwu, the land is the ultimate warrior. She may no longer sit in open judgment, but her voice still murmurs beneath the feet of those who remember. At the edge of the Roman Empire's reach, where the mist clung to the moors of northern Britain, pilgrims once gathered at a spring so clear it mirrored the sky Coventina's well. She wasn't just a water spirit, she was the pulse of Caraburg, a goddess who blurred the lines between Celtic reverence and Roman devotion. Unlike the grand temples of Jupiter or Minerva, Coventina's shrine was humble, a stone basin fed by a natural spring, surrounded by offerings tossed in by soldiers and locals alike. But don't mistake simplicity for insignificance. This was a place where coins glimmered beneath the water like fallen stars, where bronze pins and glass beads sank with whispered prayers, where the divine felt close enough to touch. The artifacts pulled from her well tell a story of desperate hope. Roman cavalrymen far from home left votives inscribed with pleas for safe returns. Mothers dipped scraps of cloth tied with locks of their children's hair, begging for health. But Coventina's most haunting offerings were the carved stone reliefs depicting her as a triple goddess, three figures lounging by the water, each holding a vessel that eternally overflowed. This wasn't just a nod to Roman artistic styles, it was a fusion of worlds. The Celts had long worshipped triple deities as embodiments of nature's cycles, and here, under Rome's shadow, Coventina became both nymph and matron, a bridge between conquerors and the conquered. Then came the silence. When Rome withdrew its legions in the 5th century, Coventina's well didn't vanish overnight. But without the empire's infrastructure, without the soldiers who'd kneeled at its edge, her cult withered. The spring still bubbled, but the coins stopped falling. The prayers dried up. By the time medieval monks chronicled the region's legends, her name had been replaced by generic tales of fairy pools and enchanted springs. The shift wasn't accidental. Christianity had little room for pagan nymphs, especially those tied to a fading imperial past. Yet Coventina's legacy resurfaced in the 19th century, when archaeologists drained her well and found over 16,000 coins, jewelry, and even a wooden model of a soldier's arm likely left by a wounded warrior seeking healing. These weren't relics of a forgotten minor deity, they were proof of a goddess who'd once held a community's heart. Modern druids and neo-pagans now leave offerings at reconstructed shrines, but the original Coventina remains elusive. Was she ever truly Roman, or did the empire simply borrow her from the land itself? The well holds its secrets, but the water at least still remembers. In the heart of the Aztec world, where temples pierced the sky like flames and the air thrummed with the beat of drums, there smoldered a deity as ancient as time itself, Huhuteotl, the wrinkled fire god. But here's the twist: this old god wasn't just a grandfatherly figure. Huhuteotl defied easy categorization, flickering between masculine and feminine in a way that unsettled later Spanish chroniclers. Imagine a being whose very essence was the hearth's glow, the crackling fire that cooked meals, forged tools, and burned offerings to the gods. Huhuteotl wasn't just a symbol of fire. This deity was fire in its most primal, transformative state, a force both creative and destructive, warm and devouring. What made Huhuteotl truly fascinating was the duality wrapped into that aged form. Pre-Aztec codices depict the deity with sagging skin and a stooped back, often seated cross-legged atop a brazier, cupping flames in gnarled hands. Yet the same texts whisper of rituals where priestesses channeled Huhuteotl's energy during childbirth, invoking the fire that burns away suffering. This fluidity, a god who could be called upon by men forging weapons and women laboring in the dark, hints at a spirituality far older than the rigid Aztec pantheon, one where gender wasn't a barrier to power but a spectrum of sacred possibility. Then came Xicotencatl, the turquoise lord. As the Aztec Empire expanded, so did its need for order. Xicotencatl, a younger, more martial fire god, began supplanting Huhuteotl in official worship. Where Huhuteotl was the hearth's quiet ember, Xicotencatl was the blazing sun at the center of state rituals. Temples once dedicated to the elder fire deity were quietly rededicated, their murals repainted to show the gleaming turquoise lord instead. But here's the catch: Huhuteotl never truly vanished. The Aztecs, for all their imperial ambition, couldn't extinguish a god that predated them by centuries. Proof lingers in the Zumulpili, the new fire ceremony held every 52 years. When the stars aligned in perfect dread, priests would extinguish every flame in the empire, plunging the world into symbolic darkness. Then atop Mount Huaxachtlan, they'd tear open a sacrificial victim's chest, using a fire drill on his still beating heart to ignite a new flame, the god invoked during this act. Officially Zu-Tekutli, but the method, the reverence for fire's cyclical rebirth, bore Huhuteotl's fingerprints. Even the victim's aged costume, often overlooked in Spanish accounts, mirrored the old god's wizened visage. Modern scholars argue this wasn't coincidence but syncretism, an empire grafting its new gods onto roots too deep to rip out. In rural villages, hearth tenders still whispered Huhuteotl's name when kindling morning fires long after Tenochtitlan fell. Today, traces survive in Dia de los Muertos rituals where candles guide souls home. The light may have new names, but the hands that tend it still remember. Some fires don't die, they simply wait, glowing beneath the ashes of time. Far to the north, where the aurora borealis paints the sky and the ice stretches endless, the Inuit whispered the name of Pingan, not just a goddess, but the very breath of the Arctic itself. While Sedna, ruler of the sea's depths, is often the face of Inuit mythology, Pinga's domain was the frozen silence above. She wasn't merely a huntress, she was the unseen force that guided caribou herds across the tundra, the judge who weighed the souls of the dead, and the keeper of balance between humanity and the wild. Where Sedna's wrath could starve a village by withholding seals, Pinga's displeasure meant empty hunting grounds and restless spirits. Her power wasn't in storms or waves, but in the subtle, relentless pulse of life on the ice. To understand Pinga is to grasp the Inuit worldview, one where survival depended on respect, not domination. Hunters prayed to her before setting traps, knowing she'd seen every misstep, every wasted kill. Shamans spoke of her as a figure clothed in caribou hide, her eyes reflecting the snow's glare, watching from the edges of dreams. Unlike the vengeful Sedna, whose severed fingers became sea creatures, Pinga's mythology lacked such visceral drama. Her stories were quieter, a whisper of wind guiding a lost hunter home, the sudden appearance of a fox as an omen. This subtlety made her no less vital. If Sedna was the crisis, Pinga was the constant, the rhythm of the hunt, the ethics of survival. But then came the missionaries, their crosses sharp against the white horizon. To them, Pinga was an obstacle, animism's intimacy, the idea that divinity lived in every stone, every gust of wind threatened their rigid doctrine. They couldn't erase Sedna, her storms were too visceral to deny. But Pinga, she was recast as a folktale, her name stripped from prayers, her role as psychopomp guide of souls handed over to angels. Colonial journals dismissed her as a superstition of hunters, ignoring how her moral code wasted nothing. Honor the animal spirit had sustained communities for generations. Yet the ice remembers. Modern Inuit elders still teach children not to point at caribou, a taboo rooted in Pinga's lore. Archaeologists find amulets carved in her likeness buried beneath old campfires, hidden away like secrets. And in the quietest hours of winter nights when the aurora dances, some say you can feel her gaze, not judging, not angry, but waiting, because divinity isn't erased by decree. It lingers in the habits of hands that still skin a seal with reverence, in the stories told under starlight when the church bells fall silent. Pinga's name may fade, but her truth is etched into the land itself, as indelible as tracks in fresh snow. In the mist-wrapped valleys of ancient Gaul, where hearth smoke curled into the twilight, stood the altars of a goddess whose name meant winding river Nantasulta. She wasn't just a guardian of the home, she was the living embodiment of its warmth, its chaos, its secrets. Picture her iconography, a woman crowned with ravens, one hand holding a small house-shaped shrine, the other a honeycomb dripping with gold. At her feet, a curious symbol, a spiral, like a river's bend or a serpent's coil. This wasn't mere decoration. Every detail whispered of a divinity who wove together the mundane and the mystical, the raven's omens with the hearth's embers. Nantasulta's ravens were the key to her paradox. In most European mythos, ravens heralded war or death, Odin's familiars, Morrigan's shadows. But here, they perched atop domestic symbols, their black feathers glinting beside clay ovens and woven baskets. This duality made her cult revolutionary. Gaulish women invoked her not just for protection, but for prophecy, interpreting the birds' flights to predict harvests or marriages. Her honeycomb, too, defied expectations. Unlike Roman Vesta's sterile purity, Nantasulta's sticky, golden offering spoke of abundance, of life's sweet messiness. Even her spiral, etched into door frames, suggested a goddess who thrived in liminal spaces where the river bends, where the smoke meets the sky. Then came the Merovingians. When Christianity hardened its grip on Gaul, Nantasulta's cult posed a unique threat. Unlike warrior gods who could be demonized as pagan brutes, she represented something subtler, the sacredness of women's daily labor. How do you erase a deity whose domain is the bread rising by the fire, the child's fever broken with herbs, the raven's cry at dawn? The answer was systematic. Her shrines, often simple stone stelae in village corners, were toppled or repurposed as Christian boundary markers. The raven, once her sacred messenger, was recast as a harbinger of sin. And the spiral, dismissed as peasant superstition, though you'll still find it hidden in the marginalia of medieval manuscripts, scratched into farmhouse beams by hands that remembered. What's chilling is how thoroughly her memory was rewritten. Early church chroniclers labeled her a folk witch, reducing her to a cautionary tale, yet traces persist. In Lorraine, folk tales speak of a Dame d'Escorbeau who brings storms if her birds are harmed. Breton midwives until the 19th century placed honey on newborns' tongues, a practice once tied to Nantasulta's blessings. Even her spiral resurfaces in Celtic Christian art, disguised as a trinity knot. The river's bend always finds its way back. Nantasulta's story isn't just about religious suppression. It's about what happens when the divine feminine is rooted not in grand temples, but in the quiet, relentless work of keeping life alive. They tore down her altars, but they couldn't extinguish the embers. Every time a baker blesses her loaf or a mother watches crows in the yard, the old goddess stirs. In the golden rivers of West Africa, where sunlight dances on the water's surface like scattered coins, the Yoruba people sang the praises of Oshun, an Orisha whose true essence has been diluted by time and translation. Modern portrayals often shrink her into a simplistic goddess of love, a figure of beauty and sweetness, draped in yellow silk and offering honeyed blessings. But peel back those layers and you'll find a deity forged in fire. Oshun didn't just preside over romance, she commanded the rivers that gave life to empires, wielded the sword of justice, and stood as a warrior when her people called. Her mythology reveals this duality in startling clarity. One of the most powerful legends tells of the Orisha's failed attempt to create the world. They struggled, toiling in vain, until Oshun arrived. It wasn't her beauty that saved them, but her raw, untapped power. She poured her sacred waters into the dry earth, and life surged forth. Yet when disrespected, those same waters could rise in devastating floods. In the Cuban diaspora, where her worship took root through Santeria, she became Ochun, but her ferocity never faded. During slavery, her devotees, often women, used her rituals as acts of resistance, hiding coded messages in songs meant to praise her, turning ceremonies into maps for escape. The Spanish colonizers saw only the glittering surface, mistaking her for a harmless spirit of femininity. They didn't recognize the warrior beneath the gold. Even her symbols betray her complexity. The fan she carries isn't just for elegance, it's a weapon used to sweep away injustice, the mirrors adorning her altars. They reflect truth, forcing those before her to confront their own deceit. And honey, so often reduced to a metaphor for sweetness, was historically used to treat wounds, a reminder that Oshun's love wasn't passive, it healed but it also demanded. In Brazil's candomblé, where she's celebrated as Oxum, initiates undergo grueling trials to embody her strength, dancing for hours in the scorching sun, their bodies glistening like river currents, proving devotion isn't just about devotion, it's endurance. The greatest misconception is that Oshun's power is soft. Tell that to the Haitian revolutionaries who invoked her alongside Ogun, the god of war, as they fought for freedom. Or to the contemporary devotees in Lagos who petition her for victory in court battles, not just marriages. Her survival in the Afro-Caribbean diaspora isn't a story of gentle persistence, it's one of adaptation, a blade cloaked in silk. Today, when women in Rio or Miami or Port-au-Prince don yellow and offer her oranges, they're not just praying for love. They're tapping into the same current that once nourished kingdoms and toppled tyrants. Oshun's waters run deep, and those who listen closely will hear the roar beneath the ripple. Among the vast pantheon of Slavic deities, none held the heavens in their hands quite like the Zoria sisters, Dawn's twin sentinels whose watchful eyes kept the apocalypse at bay. Unlike solitary sun gods or moon goddesses, these celestial siblings operated in perfect harmony, one ushering in the morning light, the other cradling the dusk. But their true power lay in a secret duty. Chained to the constellation Ursa Minor, they guarded Simagl, a monstrous hound destined to break free and devour the stars at the world's end. The faintest slackening of their vigilance and the cosmos itself would unravel. The duality of the Zorias, Zoria Utriniae, the morning star, and Zoria Veciniae, the evening star, reflected the Slavic understanding of time as a cycle, not a line. Each sister was a celestial gatekeeper, their movements choreographed with military precision. Utriniae would unlock the gates of Dawn's palace, her golden keys scattering night's shadows, while Veciniae sealed them shut at twilight, her silver veils dimming the sun's fire. Yet beyond their luminous duties, they were cosmic jailers. Simagl, the hound, wasn't just a mythical beast. He embodied chaos, a force the sisters kept leashed through ancient incantations whispered into the wind. Folktales warned that if the Zorias ever missed their rituals, his chains would weaken, his howls shaking the pillars of heaven. Christianization dealt a brutal blow to their cult. Missionaries, intent on erasing pagan astrology, recast the Zorias as vague morning lights, stripping them of their apocalyptic role. The church couldn't deny the stars, so they severed their divine ties. Simagl became a mere folktale monster, the sisters reduced to poetic metaphors for sunrise and sunset. But in rural villages, the old knowledge clung to life. Farmers still left bowls of milk at crossroads at dawn and dusk, offerings to the kindly ones who might yet hold back the dark. Hidden in plain sight, their legacy endures. Scholars note that the Polish word for dawn, Zorza, still echoes their name, and fragments of their star hymns survive in lullabies. Even modern astronomers unwittingly honor them. Ursa Minor is still called the Little Bear, but the chain of stars anchoring it, that was once Simagl's leash, held fast by hands we've forgotten were divine. The Zoria's fate reveals a chilling truth. Some gods don't die. They fade until we mistake them for mere weather or stories or the idle turn of the stars. But look closely at the horizon at twilight, that flicker between gold and violet. That's the sisters' changing shifts, still on duty, still watching. The chain may rust, but it hasn't broken. Not yet. In the shimmering heat of ancient Syria, where the Euphrates curled like a lazy serpent, stood the temple of Atargates, a goddess so entwined with water that her very tears were said to form rivers. But this wasn't the graceful Aphrodite rising from sea foam. Atargates was something wilder, darker, a deity whose origins plunged into the depths of primal fear and devotion. Picture her, a mermaid with the tail of a fish and the torso of a woman, crowned with the crescent moon, her scales glinting in the torchlight of her temple at Hierapolis. Pilgrims traveled for weeks to bathe in her sacred pools, where fish her children darted between their legs, forbidden to eat on pain of curses. Goddesses' myths were drenched in tragedy. One version tells how she fell in love with a mortal shepherd, only to accidentally cause his death. Overcome with grief, she threw herself into a lake, but the waters refused to drown her. Instead, they transformed her, merging her human beauty with the creatures she'd once ruled. This wasn't just a poetic metamorphosis, it was a warning. Fish became sacred because they carried her essence, a taboo so strict that even accidental consumption required elaborate purification rites. The priests of Hierapolis wore fish-scale armor during rituals, their chants echoing like waves against the temple walls, a sound meant to mimic her voice. Then came the Greeks, always eager to map foreign gods onto their own pantheon. They called her Decode, linking her to Aphrodite, but where Aphrodite embodied love's allure, Goddesses held dominion over its dangerous undercurrents. Even Esther's story in the Hebrew Bible might whisper her influence. Some scholars argue the tale of a queen saving her people mirrors Goddesses' role as a protector of cities. But these connections came at a cost. As Hellenistic culture spread, her rituals were sanitized, her fierce individuality sanded down to fit Greek tastes. The final blow came with Rome's rise. Pompey's soldiers, storming Hierapolis in the 1st century BCE, found a temple overflowing with gold and no patience for local superstitions. The sacred pools were drained, the fish slaughtered, the statues melted into coinage. Yet like water seeping through cracks, Goddesses survived. Syrian Christians quietly kept her fish taboos, rebranding them as fasting rituals. Fishermen in Lebanon still toss crumbs into the sea for the lady, though few remember her name, and in the mermaid myths that ripple across cultures from the Mediterranean to the British Isles, her shadow lingers, a reminder that some gods can't be drowned, only forgotten. From the storm-churned waves of the Atlantic to the tranquil rivers threading through West African villages, Mami Wata's presence has always been as fluid as the waters she rules. She's no single goddess with a fixed form, but a kaleidoscope of traditions, part mermaid, part serpent, part radiant woman draped in gold, her laughter echoing in the crash of waves. Long before European ships ever touched African shores, she was already whispering in the dreams of fishermen and healers, offering abundance to those who respected her depths and wrath to those who dared exploit them. Her earliest depictions, carved into cave walls and river stones, a woman with the tail of a fish, coiled snakes in her hands, eyes glinting like sunlight on water. But Mami Wata's story took a sinister turn when colonizers arrived. Missionaries, horrified by her worship, especially the ecstatic dances and possession rituals performed by her priestesses, painted her as a demon. They called her Mami Wata, twisting her name into something grotesque, a siren luring men to drown. In Nigeria, British administrators outlawed her ceremonies, jailing devotees. In the Caribbean, enslaved Africans were whipped for whispering her prayers. Yet here's the paradox, the very violence meant to erase her only deepened her resonance. Enslaved people smuggled her worship across the ocean, hiding her iconography in Catholic saint statues, mermaids disguised as the Virgin Mary, snake motifs woven into rosary beads. In Haiti, she merged with Azuli, the Vodou spirit of love and luxury, her altars gleaming with perfume and coins. In Brazil, she became Iemanjá, crowned with ocean foam, her festivals drawing millions to the shores even today. What's astonishing isn't just her survival, but her rebellion. Mami Wata didn't just adapt, she weaponized the colonial gaze. European traders, obsessed with exotic art, commissioned prints of a bare-breasted mermaid, never realizing they were spreading her image far and wide. The very posters meant to titillate foreign audiences became sacred objects in diaspora communities, proof that the goddess could hijack the tools of oppression. Even now, her most iconic symbol, a 1950s German circus poster of a sultry snake charmer, hangs in shrines from Benin to Brooklyn, a testament to her cunning. Modern attempts to sanitize her miss the point. Tourist shops sell trinkets of a smiling mermaid, but Mommy Water was never just about beauty. She's the tempest and the tide, the dealer of brutal blessings. Haitian fishermen still fear her whirlpools, Ghanaian market women pray to her for ruthless business savvy, and Congo's river pirates ask her protection before raids. Her duality, life-giver and life-taker, is what colonial powers failed to crush. Because water doesn't fight, it flows around obstacles, wearing down stone over centuries. Mommy Water's greatest trick, letting them think she'd vanished while all along she was rising. Beneath the budding branches of early spring, when the first crocuses push through thawing soil, the name of Eosta lingers like a half-remembered dream. This Germanic goddess of dawn and renewal has become entangled in a web of modern myth, some of it earnest revival, much of it pure invention, the truth. We know startlingly little about her. A single sentence from the 8th century monk Bede mentions her festival in April, a time when Anglo-Saxons celebrated the season's rebirth, possibly with offerings of colored eggs and hares. That's it, no grand epics, no temple ruins, just a whisper of veneration carried on the wind. Yet Eosta's shadow stretches far beyond that fragile historical thread. Her name pulses through language itself, giving us the word Easter, though the holiday's modern trappings, chocolate bunnies, pastel eggs, bear little resemblance to ancient rites. Scholars argue whether her worship was widespread or localized, whether she was a major deity or a minor spirit of the vernal equinox, the hares often linked to her. They might symbolize fertility, or they might be later additions conflated from Celtic traditions. Even the radiant dawn imagery could be poetic license, a monk's attempt to graft Christian resurrection onto older, earthier celebrations. The real distortion came in the 19th century, when romantic nationalists and early neo-pagans, hungry for a pre-Christian past, spun Eosta into a full-fledged fertility goddess. Jacob Grimm, of fairy tale fame, speculated wildly about her in his Teutonic mythology, imagining rituals never attested in primary sources. By the 20th century, these guesses hardened into fact, recycled in books and rituals until the invented Eosta, a flower-crowned maiden surrounded by rabbits, overshadowed the historical ghost. But dismissing her entirely would be a mistake. Linguistic archaeology reveals tantalizing clues. The Old English Eosta shares roots with Ostro, the Proto-Indo-European word for dawn, linking her to a vast family of morning deities like the Roman Aurora and Hindu Ushers. These goddesses weren't just pretty symbols, they embodied the daily victory of light over darkness, a cycle as vital to farmers as rain. If Eosta followed this pattern, her rites likely honored not just spring's beauty, but its precariousness, the fear that winter might never loosen its grip. So where does that leave us? Somewhere between skepticism and reverence. Eosta may lack the elaborate myths of Isis or Athena, but absence doesn't equal insignificance. Perhaps her power lay precisely in her ephemerality, a deity celebrated not in stone, but in the turn of seasons, the blush of dawn on frost. The next time you see a child hunting Easter eggs, remember, beneath the plastic grass and foil wrappers, there's an echo of something older, a goddess who knew that light, like memory, is fragile. And that makes her worth listening for. In the sun-baked highlands of ancient Canon, where the scent of burning incense clung to the air and the temples thrummed with the chant of priestesses, Asherah reigned not as a minor fertility figure, but as the mother goddess Yahweh's own divine consort. This isn't speculative heresy, it's etched in pottery and stone. Thousands of terracotta figurines unearthed across Israel and Judah depict her full-bodied and nude, hands cupping her breasts, a sacred tree of life coiled between her fingers. These weren't mere decorations, they were devotional objects clutched in the hands of women praying for safe births, farmers begging for rain, kings seeking legitimacy. The Bible itself, in passages like 2 Kings 23, grudgingly admits her worship thrived in Solomon's very temple, where her carved wooden poles Asherim, stood beside Yahweh's altar for centuries. But something shifted around the 7th century BCE. A religious revolution, now called the Deuteronomistic Reform, swept through Judah, spearheaded by scribes determined to purge polytheism. Asherah's name was systematically scrubbed from texts, her priests disbanded, her sacred groves hacked down. The reasons weren't just theological, they were political. A centralized cult of Yahweh bolstered the power of Jerusalem's elite, while Asherah's decentralized, woman-led rites threatened their control. Archaeologists have found stacks of her figurines deliberately shattered in pits, their fragments buried in a ritual act of silencing. Even the word Asherah was later misread as a mere wooden post rather than a living goddess. The evidence, however, refuses to stay buried. At Khirbet el-Kham, an 8th century BC tomb inscription praises Yahweh and his Asherah, confirming their divine partnership. In Kuntalit Ajrud, a desert outpost's wall painting shows two figures, one unmistakably Yahweh, the other likely Asherah, beneath a blessing that names them together. These weren't fringe cults, they were mainstream worship. Even more telling are the countless loom weights and spindle walls found near her shrines, proof that her priestesses weren't passive acolytes but skilled artisans weaving both cloth and cosmology. What's chilling is how thorough the erasure nearly was. Later scribes rewrote older texts, inserting polemics against Asherah worship where none originally existed. By the time the Hebrew Bible reached its final form, she'd been reduced to a villain, a seductress leading Israelites astray. Yet in the margins of history, she persisted. Jewish women in the Hellenistic era still baked cakes for the Queen of Heaven, a title once Asherah's. Early Christian amulets found in Gaza invoke her protection alongside Mary's. Even Kabbalah's Shekinah, the divine feminine presence, carries echoes of her exiled power. Asherah's story isn't just about lost goddesses, it's about who gets to write history and why. The Deuteronomists won the battle of orthodoxy, but the earth remembers. Every time a shovel turns up another of her figurines, cracked but unbroken, it's a reminder, silencing isn't the same as destruction. Some truths, like sacred trees, have roots too deep to pull. In the quiet ripple of temple bells and the whisper of silk strings across a biwa, Japan once honored a goddess who defied easy categorization: Benzaiten, the dragon slayer, the patron of music, the warrior whose voice could still storms. Originally Saraswati, the Hindu river goddess of wisdom and arts, her journey across the Silk Road transformed her into something uniquely Japanese. By the time she reached the shores of Inoshima and Itsukushima, she had shed her Vedic roots like a serpent shedding skin, emerging as Benzaiten, a deity who wielded both a lute and a sword, her white robes now adorned with the scales of a dragon. Her shrines were often built near water, lakes, rivers, the sea echoing her origins as a river goddess. But in Japan, the water took on new meaning. The shimmering surface became a metaphor for sound, for the way music flows and bends like a current. Musicians would pray to her before performances, not just for skill, but for the divine inspiration that turned notes into spells. Yet Benzaiten's power wasn't limited to artistry. Ancient scrolls depict her riding a dragon into battle, her melody weaving through the clash of steel, her voice a weapon as deadly as any arrow. This duality, creator and destroyer, made her indispensable. She was the patron of geishas and samurai alike, a reminder that beauty and violence could share the same breath. Then came the Meiji Restoration, a seismic shift that sought to purify Japan's spiritual landscape. In the late 19th century, the government mandated the separation of Shinto and Buddhism, a policy called Shinbatsu Bunri. Overnight, Benzaiten, a fusion of Hindu, Buddhist, and local folk traditions, became a target. Shrines that had housed her for centuries were stripped of Buddhist iconography, her statues were hidden or destroyed. The very things that made her magnificent, her mixed heritage, her adaptability, now made her dangerous. The dragon was chained, the lute silenced, yet like all resilient deities, Benzaiten refused to disappear entirely. In secret, fishermen still left offerings at her coastal shrines, whispering prayers for calm seas. Blind lute players who'd once relied on her patronage kept her hymns alive in underground performances. And today, if you visit Inoshima at dusk when the tide rolls in and the lanterns flicker to life, you might catch a glimpse of her legacy, not in grand statues, but in the way a musician's fingers hesitate over the strings, as if waiting for a goddess to guide them once more. The Meiji era tried to erase her, but some melodies are too haunting to forget. When thunder splits the sky and the winds roar like 1,000 voices, that's when Oya makes her presence known, not as Shango's consort, not as a supporting character in another god's myth, but as the Yoruba storm goddess who commands the whirlwind, the marketplace, and the very gateway between life and death. Too often reduced to a fiery-tempered wife in popular retellings, Oya's true power lies in her unmatched sovereignty. Her name means she tore, a nod to the way she rips apart stagnation, whether it's dead leaves clinging to branches or souls refusing to cross into the afterlife. In Nigeria, she's depicted with a sword in one hand and a fly whisk in the other, symbols of her dual role, warrior and psychopomp, the one who clears the path for transformation. Her connection to the dead isn't merely symbolic. Traditional Yoruba belief holds that Oya owns the cemetery gates, her winds carrying messages to ancestors. In Cuba, where her worship took root as part of the Lucumi tradition during slavery, this aspect deepened. Here she became Oya, guardian of the Bovda, the ancestral altar where candles flicker in hurricane glasses to keep her winds from extinguishing the light. Palo Mayan practitioners invoke her as Oya Funke, the spark that ignites change, her storms visualized through red and maroon fabrics draped over sacred cauldrons. But what's often overlooked is how her worship became covert resistance. Enslaved Lucumi women used Oya's iconography to hide survival strategies. The 9 colors of her skirt represented escape routes, the patterns of her beads encoded maps to safe houses. The colonial attempt to dilute her speaks volumes. Spanish records deliberately framed her as merely Shango's fiery wife, downplaying her necromantic rites as superstition. Yet in secret, her followers kept the truth alive. During Havana's darkest nights, they'd leave 9 pennies at crossroads, a silent offering to the goddess who could summon spirits to guide runaways. Modern Santeria still bears these scars. While Shango's drums dominate public ceremonies, Oya's rituals often happen behind closed doors, her initiates whispering prayers into the mouths of river stones believed to hold the voices of the dead. Her storm isn't just destruction, it's revelation. When Hurricane Sandy ravaged the Caribbean in 2012, practitioners in Miami swore they saw her silhouette in the swirling clouds, her skirts whipping the ocean into frenzy. And perhaps they weren't wrong. Oya doesn't just ride the wind, she is the wind, the force that strips away lies, the gust that carries forgotten names back to the living. To honor her isn't to tame her, it's to stand in the storm and let it remake you. When the first frost claws its way across the highlands and the rivers lock themselves in ice, that's when the Kaleech stirs. Not a witch, not a crone, but the primordial architect of the Gaelic world, her hands molding mountains like clay, her breath hurling blizzards across the moors. While Brigid, her luminous counterpart, tends the hearth of spring, the Kaleech rules the raw, untamed threshold, the moment when the land itself seems to hold its breath. She isn't merely a seasonal symbol, she's the embodiment of winter's creative destruction, the force that grinds rock into soil and sculpts valleys with glacial indifference. The tales paint her in stark contrasts. In one breath, she's the benevolent guardian of deer herds, her cloak swirling with snow as she leads them to shelter. In the next, she's the vengeful hag who hurls boulders at rivals, leaving scars on the landscape still visible today. The legend of the Corryvreckan whirlpool off Scotland's coast claims it was carved by her staff, a churning testament to her temper. Yet her most profound role is as the keeper of sovereignty. Ancient kings sought her blessing not in golden halls, but on wind-swept peaks where she tested their worthiness, a ritual echoing the land's own brutal cycles of death and renewal. Christian scribes, however, couldn't tolerate such untamed divinity. By the Middle Ages, the Cailleach had been demoted to a cautionary figure, a monstrous foil to Saint Brigid's purity. Folktales twisted her into a stingy old woman cursed to wander until she dropped a magical stone, a far cry from the sovereign who once shaped nations. Even her association with Brigid, once a harmonious balance of winter and spring, was recast as a battle, with Brigid defeating her to usher in warmth. The truth, buried in older oral traditions, suggests they were two faces of the same cycle, interdependent as frost and thaw. Yet the land remembers what the texts erased. In the Hebrides, fishermen still avoid certain waters during her reign from Samhain to Beltane, sensing her presence in the gales. The Gaelic word Cailleach itself, meaning veiled one, lingers in place names like the Callanish stones, where locals whisper that the standing circles are her frozen court. Modern pagans honor her as a deity of ecological resilience, a reminder that creation often wears the guise of destruction. The Cailleach's legacy isn't just in myths but in the very bones of the earth. Every glacier-split cliff, every wind-scoured plain bears her signature. They tried to bury her under saints' robes and morality tales, but her voice still howls through the gaps, a reminder that some forces are too vast to be tamed by pen or scripture. Winter, after all, always returns. From the compassionate justice of Nanch to the tempestuous storms of Oya, these forgotten goddesses paint a mosaic of divine power that once shaped entire civilizations, only to be buried under conquest, conversion, and the relentless march of history. Their stories aren't just footnotes, they're fragments of a shattered mirror, each reflecting a different facet of what humanity once revered. The nurturing and the fierce, the creators and the destroyers, the voices that whispered through rivers, winds, and the quiet corners of daily life. What unites them isn't just their obscurity, but the patterns of their erasure, how colonial powers demonized them, how empires absorbed and diluted them, how scribes scrubbed their names from records until only echoes remained. But here's the thrilling part, these echoes are growing louder. Archaeologists dust off figurines with new reverence. Linguists trace their names through forgotten dialects. Neo-pagans and scholars alike are stitching their stories back together, not as relics, but as vital truths about resilience and cultural memory. Think of the Haitian revolutionaries who resurrected Oya's fury in their fight for freedom, or the Yoruba herbalists preserving Oja's knowledge in the face of deforestation. These goddesses aren't just history, they're blueprints for how we might remember what's been lost and why it matters. So why stop here? Every corner of the globe hides its own divine shadows. Maybe your hometown has a river once sacred to a local nymph, or a folk tale about a crone who controlled the harvest. Dig deeper, listen for the names that don't appear in textbooks. And if you felt a spark of recognition while watching this, whether for Anahit's golden defiance or Tawarit's snarling protection, drop a comment below. Tell us which goddess resonated with you or one you've uncovered in your own explorations. This isn't the end of the conversation, it's an invitation. Hit subscribe to join us for more deep dives into the myths that shape us, even when we've forgotten their names, because the past isn't silent. It's waiting for someone to listen.